You watch as others effortlessly command respect and obedience, while your requests are ignored or dismissed, leaving you powerless in crucial moments. Every day you witness people with less knowledge and experience wielding influence that should rightfully be yours, while you remain on the sidelines, wondering what secret they possess. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, and I spent my life studying the mechanisms of power in the treacherous courts of Renaissance Italy, where one misstep meant exile or death. What I discovered about human nature and control will transform how you navigate every relationship and situation in your life, giving you the ability to influence outcomes and shape the behavior of others with precision and permanence. The same principles that allowed princes to maintain iron grips on their kingdoms can give you unshakable influence in your modern world, whether in business, relationships, or any arena where power matters. But first, like this video, subscribe for more forbidden wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of influence. I was 29 when I first walked through the halls of the Palazzo Vecchio as the newly appointed secretary of the Florentine Republic. The marble floors had been polished by centuries of political maneuvering, and I could feel the weight of history beneath my feet. What I didn't realize then was that I was about to receive the most brutal education in power that any man could endure. Florence in 1498 was a city caught between giants. To our north, the French armies of Louis XII cast long shadows across the Alps. To our south, the Papal States writhed with intrigue under the iron fist of the Borgias. And everywhere, the spectre of Spanish influence crept through Italian politics like morning fog through the Arno Valley. I thought I understood power. Then I was a fool. My first diplomatic mission taught me otherwise. I was sent to negotiate with Caterina Sforza, the Countess of Foch, a woman who had seized her dead husband's fortress by threatening to destroy it rather than surrender it to his enemies. When I met her, she was nursing an infant while simultaneously planning the execution of 3 conspirators who had tried to poison her wine. She looked at me across her war room table and said, "Young man, in politics there are no accidents. Everything that happens was planned by someone who benefits from it." I spent 14 years serving the Republic, watching as stronger powers carved up Italy like a Christmas feast. I negotiated with kings who smiled while planning our destruction. I witnessed the brutal efficiency of Caesar Borgia as he conquered the Romagna with a combination of strategic brilliance and calculated terror. I learned that treaties were written in water, that alliances shifted with the wind, and that the only constant in politics was the pursuit of self-interest. But it was my proximity to real power that taught me its most essential truth. Those who wield it effectively never hesitate to use whatever methods serve their goals. I watched Borgia execute his own commander, Ramiro de Lorca, in the public square of Cessanone, because Ramiro had failed, but because the people needed to see that even Borgia's closest allies were expendable. The message was clear, absolute. Loyalty was expected, and absolute power would be maintained. I thought I was learning these lessons as an observer, safely insulated by my position as a civil servant. I was wrong. Power is not a spectator sport, and eventually, every observer becomes a participant. The Medici family had been exiled from Florence for 18 years when I began my service. Cosimo and Lorenzo the Magnificent were just names in history books. Their banking empire a cautionary tale about the dangers of concentrating too much wealth and influence. But power, I learned, is like water, it always finds a way to flow back to its natural level. In 1512, the Spanish armies rolled across Tuscany like a tide of steel and fire. The Florentine Republic, weakened by years of foreign interference and internal divisions, crumbled in weeks. The Medici returned to Florence, not as citizens requesting forgiveness, but as conquerors claiming their birthright. Giovanni de' Medici, who would soon become Pope Leo X, had orchestrated their return with the precision of a master chess player. Using Spanish military might as his knights and bishops, I was arrested on charges of conspiracy against the new Medici government. The accusations were fabricated, but in politics, truth is less important than perception. They needed scapegoats to demonstrate their power, and former Republican officials made perfect targets. For 22 days, I was imprisoned in the Bargello, tortured with a strappado, my arms bound behind my back, hoisted by rope until my shoulders separated. Each time they dropped me, each time the rope caught my weight, I felt not just physical pain, but the shattering of every illusion I had held about justice, mercy, and the rule of law. It was in that cell, listening to my own screams echo off stone walls, that I truly understood power for the first time. The Medici didn't torture me because they believed I was guilty. They tortured me because they needed to demonstrate that resistance was futile, that their return meant the complete subjugation of anyone who had served the Republic. Fear, I realized, was not a byproduct of power, it was power's most essential tool. When they finally released me to internal exile at my small estate in Sant'Andrea, I was a different man. Stripped of position, influence, and illusion, I began to see human nature with the clarity that only comes from absolute defeat. The peasants who had once bowed respectfully now looked through me as if I were invisible. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid acknowledging my presence. I had become politically dead, and in Renaissance Italy, political death was often followed by the physical variety. But exile gave me something more valuable than position ever had: the perspective to understand what I had witnessed. Removed from the daily intrigues of statecraft, I could finally see the patterns that had been invisible when I was enmeshed in them. Power, I realized, operated according to laws as predictable as those governing the movement of planets. The strong dominated the weak, not through accident or divine will, but through the systematic application of principles that could be studied, understood, and mastered. In my exile, I began to understand that Italy itself had become a vast laboratory for studying human nature under extreme conditions. Every city-state was an experiment in power. Every war a test of different theories about how to control and influence others. And nowhere was this more evident than in my observations of Caesar Borgia, the most fascinating and terrifying specimen of political evolution I had ever encountered. I first met Borgia in 1502, when Florence sent me as an envoy to his court. In Imola, he was 27 years old, the bastard son of Pope Alexander VI, and he had already carved out a kingdom for himself in the Romagna, through a combination of military genius and psychological warfare that left me both horrified and mesmerized. When I entered his presence, he was studying a map of central Italy, marking territories with different colored pins: red for conquered, blue for allied, black for enemies to be eliminated. "Secretary Machiavelli," he said, without looking up from his map, "you arrive at an interesting moment. I am deciding whether to destroy Urbino by siege or by treachery. Which would you recommend?" The question was a test, and I knew it. Any answer would reveal something about Florence's intentions and my own character. But as I watched him move those pins across the map like a chess master, contemplating his next move, I realized I was witnessing something unprecedented. A man who approached power as a science rather than an art. Over the following months, as I shuttled between Florence and Borgia's mobile court, I watched him demonstrate principles of control that contradicted everything I had been taught about leadership. Traditional rulers, I had observed, relied on inherited authority, popular support, or divine mandate. Borgia relied on none of these. Instead, he had developed a system based on the calculated manipulation of human psychology. His first principle was the strategic use of cruelty. When he conquered a new territory, he would appoint a brutal governor to to crush all resistance and eliminate potential threats. The people would suffer under this oppression until they were desperate for relief. Then, at the precise moment when their hatred reached its peak, Borgia would arrive to execute the governor publicly, positioning himself as their liberator rather than their conqueror. The people would celebrate their deliverance, never realizing that their suffering and salvation had both been orchestrated by the same man. I watched him execute this strategy in Cesena, where his governor Ramiro de Lorca had spent months terrorizing the population on Borgia's secret orders. When Borgia finally had Ramiro executed in the town square, the people cheered his name as if he were a hero rather than the architect of their misery. In that moment, I understood that perception could be more powerful than reality, and that a skilled manipulator could make people grateful for ending suffering he had created. But it was Borgia's treatment of his allies that taught me the most about human nature. He had formed a conspiracy with several condottieri mercenary captains who commanded their own armies. These men had helped him conquer the Romagna, expecting to share in the spoils of victory. Instead, Borgia invited them to a celebration at Senigallia, where he had them all arrested and executed in a single night. What struck me wasn't the brutality of the act, but the psychological brilliance behind it. The most sophisticated version of this technique involves helping people get what they want in ways that also serve your interests. This is infinitely more effective than trying to force people to act against their nature. If your employee wants promotion and recognition, give them a high-profile project that also advances your department's goals. If your client wants to feel important and respected, involve them in the decision-making process while steering them toward the conclusions you prefer. The beauty of this approach is that people will thank you for manipulating them because they're getting what they want. They never realize that their desires were identified, cultivated, and channeled to serve your purposes. They believe they're acting freely, which makes them more committed to the outcomes you've engineered. But here's the crucial warning. Never reveal that you understand this principle. People desperately need to believe that their motives are pure and their choices are freely made. If you expose their self-interest too directly, they will turn against you, not because you're wrong, but because you're right. The truth about human nature is something most people cannot psychologically afford to acknowledge. Instead, always give people a noble reason for doing what you want them to do. Let them believe they're acting from high principles, while you quietly arrange for those principles to align with their interest. The recognition-seeking colleague should believe they're supporting the team, not seeking personal glory. The security-focused spouse should believe they're being prudent, not controlling. This is the first dark truth that separates those who wield influence from those who are influenced. Everyone is selfish, but most people need to pretend they're not. Your power comes from seeing through the pretense while helping others maintain their illusions. Give them what they want, let them believe they're noble for wanting it, and they will give you everything you need. The second principle of lasting control is creating dependency. And I learned this by observing the rise and fall of the condottieri, the mercenary captains who dominated Italian warfare. These men commanded armies, controlled territories, and lived like kings. But they all shared a fatal weakness. They were completely dependent on their employers for resources and legitimacy. The moment their patrons decided they were no longer useful, their power evaporated overnight. The most instructive example was Bartolomeo d'Alviano, one of the most feared military commanders of his generation. When I first encountered him in 1503, he controlled an army of 8,000 men and had carved out a virtual kingdom in the Veneto. Kings courted his alliance, princes feared his enmity, and lesser nobles competed for his attention. But Alviano had made a crucial error. He had built his power on independence rather than indispensability. When the League of Cambrai was formed against Venice in 1508, Alviano found himself without allies or resources. His mighty army melted away as soldiers sought employment elsewhere. His territories were overrun by enemies who no longer feared his retaliation. Within months, one of Italy's most powerful men had become a refugee begging for sanctuary. His mistake wasn't military or political, it was psychological. He had never made himself essential to anyone else's success. True control comes not from your independence, but from others' dependence on you. The goal is to position yourself so that other people need you more than you need them. This creates an imbalance of power that works in your favor, even when you appear to be the weaker party in a relationship. I perfected this technique during my years as secretary. When I had to manage relationships with much more powerful figures, I couldn't match their wealth, armies, or political connections, but I could make myself indispensable by controlling something they needed but couldn't get elsewhere. In my case, it was information and diplomatic expertise. Florence's survival depended on playing larger powers against each other, and I became the architect of this delicate balance. I developed networks of informants throughout Italy and beyond, giving me access to intelligence that even kings couldn't obtain through their official channels. I cultivated relationships with diplomats, merchants, soldiers, and spies, creating a web of information that flowed through me to Florence's leadership. But I didn't just collect information, I became the only person who could interpret and apply it effectively. I studied the personalities, weaknesses, and motivations of every major political figure in Europe. I understood their private fears, secret alliances, and hidden vulnerabilities. More importantly, I was the only one who could translate this knowledge into actionable diplomatic strategy. This made me irreplaceable, even to people who outranked me politically. Foreign ambassadors would request meetings with me specifically because they knew I possessed insights they couldn't get from anyone else. Florentine leaders relied on my analysis, even when they disagreed with my conclusions. I had created a situation where my value wasn't based on my position, but on my unique ability to provide something others desperately needed. The key to creating dependency is identifying resources or capabilities that are both essential and scarce, then positioning yourself as the exclusive source of those resources. This could be information, expertise, connections, access, or even emotional support. The crucial element is exclusivity. Others can get what you provide from multiple sources. You have no leverage. Consider how Lorenzo de' Medici maintained control over Florence. Despite never holding official political office, he made himself indispensable by becoming the exclusive gateway to credit for both the Florentine government and its leading citizens. Need money to fund a military campaign? You had to go through Lorenzo. Want to finance a trading venture or family marriage? Lorenzo's approval was essential. Even his political enemies couldn't afford to oppose him too vigorously because they needed his financial services for their own survival. The modern application of this principle is equally powerful. In any organization, identify the resources, skills, or relationships that others need but cannot easily obtain elsewhere. Then position yourself as the exclusive or primary source of those resources. This might mean becoming the person who understands a critical system, maintains important client relationships, or possesses specialized knowledge that others rely on. But creating dependency goes beyond just controlling resources. It involves shaping others' needs so they become more reliant on what you provide. This is the subtle difference between reactive and proactive dependency creation. Instead of just responding to existing needs, you cultivate new needs that only you can satisfy. I did this by gradually expanding my role beyond simple intelligence, gathering to strategic analysis and diplomatic problems. I began presenting not just information, but interpretation and recommendations. Over time, people stopped thinking of me as a source of data and started seeing me as a source of solutions. They became dependent not just on what I knew, but on how I thought. The most sophisticated form of dependency creation involves making yourself essential to other people's self-image and emotional well-being. When someone's confidence, happiness, or sense of purpose becomes tied to your approval and support, you wield a form of power that transcends any official authority. They will protect and serve your interests because those interests have become inseparable from their own psychological needs. This technique requires patience and subtlety. You must gradually increase people's reliance on you while making the process feel natural and beneficial to them. Rush the process, and they will recognize the manipulation and resist it. Move too slowly, and opportunities will pass before you've established sufficient leverage. The ultimate goal is to reach a point where removing you would be more costly and painful than accommodating your interests. When people's success, security, or happiness depends on your continued cooperation, they will go to extraordinary lengths to keep you satisfied. They will defend you against criticism, include you in important decisions, and consider your preferences in their planning. But remember, dependency must be mutual to be sustainable. If you make others completely dependent on you while remaining independent yourself, you become a target for elimination. The most effective approach is to create a web of mutual dependencies where everyone needs everyone else, but you sit at the center of the web, making you the most connected and therefore the most powerful node in the network. Fear is the most reliable tool of influence because it is the most fundamental human emotion. While love, gratitude, and loyalty can fade or be transferred to others, fear endures as long as its source remains credible. I learned this lesson by watching how Caesar Borgia maintained control over his territories not through affection, but through the carefully calibrated application of consequences that made resistance seem impossible and submission seem wise. The key to using fear effectively is understanding that it must be precise, predictable, and proportional. Random violence creates chaos, not control. But fear that follows clear rules creates order. People will adjust their behavior to avoid negative consequences if they understand exactly what triggers those consequences and believe that you have both the will and the ability to enforce them. I observed this principle in action when Borgia dealt with a rebellion rather than massacre the rebels, which would have created martyrs and motivated further resistance. He executed only the 3 ringleaders in a very public and ceremonial manner. He then pardoned all the other participants, but required them to swear a new oath of loyalty in front of the entire town. The message was clear: rebellion would be punished, but redemption was possible for those who demonstrated genuine submission. What made this so effective was the precision of the consequences. Everyone understood exactly what behavior would trigger punishment and what behavior would earn forgiveness. The fear was focused on specific actions, not on random persecution. This gave people a sense of control over their own fate while ensuring that control served Borgia's interests. The psychological foundation of effective fear. Fear is uncertainty about timing, combined with certainty about consequences. People must believe that punishment will definitely occur if they cross your boundaries, but they should never know exactly when or how it will happen. This uncertainty keeps them constantly aware of the potential consequences without allowing them to prepare countermeasures. I applied this principle during my negotiations with the Swiss mercenaries who were threatening Florence in 1512. These men were professional soldiers who feared no enemy in open combat, but they had families and reputations that could be threatened in ways that bypassed their military strengths. I began spreading rumors through their home cantons about mercenaries who had been branded as traitors and banned from ever returning to Switzerland. I arranged for some of their family members to receive visits from mysterious strangers, asking questions about their absent relatives. None of these actions constituted direct threats, but they created an atmosphere of uncertainty that made the mercenaries question whether their contract with Florence's enemies was worth the potential long-term costs to their personal security. Within weeks, they were negotiating for terms to end their involvement in the conflict. They had been defeated not by superior force, but by superior psychology. The most sophisticated application of fear involves making people afraid of losing something they already possess, rather than afraid of direct punishment. Loss, aversion, is a more powerful motivator than the desire for gain. People will work harder to protect what they have than to acquire what they want. This means you can control behavior more effectively by threatening to remove benefits than by promising to provide them. During my time as secretary, I used this technique to maintain discipline among the citizen militia we were training to defend Florence. Rather than motivating them with promises of glory or payment, I focused on what they would lose if they failed in their duties. I arranged for them to see their families enjoying special privileges, better housing, exemption from certain taxes, priority access to public services that were explicitly tied to their military service. The soldiers began to see their military obligations not as burdens imposed from above, but as the foundation of their families' improved circumstances. They became afraid of losing these benefits, which meant they became afraid of failing in their duties. This fear was much more reliable than patriotic enthusiasm because it was tied to their daily experience of tangible benefits. But the most powerful form of fear is social fear, the fear of losing status, reputation, or belonging within a group. Humans are fundamentally social creatures, and the threat of exclusion or humiliation can be more motivating than the threat of physical harm. I learned this by observing how the Medici maintained loyalty among Florence's elite families after their return to power. Rather than executing their former opponents, the Medici used social exclusion as their primary tool of control. Families who had opposed them found themselves uninvited to important social gatherings, excluded from lucrative business opportunities, and subtly ostracized by their former friends and allies. Their children were not considered suitable marriage partners for other prominent families. Their opinions were no longer sought on important matters. This social death was in many ways more devastating than physical death because it was ongoing and visible. The victims had to live with their reduced status every day, and their families suffered the consequences of their political choices. More importantly, other families observed these consequences and adjusted their behavior accordingly. The fear of social exclusion became a powerful deterrent to future opposition. The key to implementing social fear is controlling or influencing the groups that matter to your targets. This might mean having allies in professional associations, social clubs, religious organizations, or informal networks that provide status and belonging. When you can threaten someone's standing in groups they care about, you can influence their behavior even when you have no direct authority over them. However, fear must be balanced with hope to be truly effective. Pure terror creates desperate people who have nothing left to lose, and desperate people are dangerous and unpredictable. The most effective fear-based control systems always include a path to redemption or improvement. People must believe that compliance will be rewarded, and that their situation can improve if they make the right choices. This is why successful tyrants throughout history have combined harsh punishment for disobedience with generous rewards for loyalty. They create a system where fear motivates initial compliance, but hope motivates continued cooperation. The fear keeps people from rebelling, while the hope keeps them invested in the system that oppresses them. The final principle of using fear effectively is that you must be willing to follow through on your threats. Empty threats destroy your credibility and actually reduce your power. People will test your boundaries, and if they discover that your bark is worse than your bite, they will lose respect for your authority. This means you should never threaten consequences that you're not prepared to implement, and you should never bluff with stakes you can't afford to lose. Fear is a tool, not an end in itself. The goal is not to terrorize people, but to create a predictable environment where everyone understands the rules and adjusts their behavior accordingly. When people know exactly what is expected of them and what will happen if they fail to meet those expectations, they can make rational choices about their conduct. This creates stability and order, which serves everyone's interests, including your own. The most elegant form of control is making people believe they are choosing freely, while ensuring that every choice they can make serves your interests. This is infinitely more effective than forcing compliance, because people will defend decisions they believe they made autonomously, even when those decisions ultimately benefit you more than them. I discovered this principle while negotiating the complex treaty arrangements that kept Florence alive during the Italian wars. We were constantly caught between France and Spain, two powers that could crush us individually but were too evenly matched to ignore our strategic position. My job was to make both sides believe that Florence was choosing to support them based on shared interests and mutual respect, when in reality we were simply choosing the option that offered the best chance of survival at any given moment. The key was never presenting our negotiations as desperate pleas for protection. Instead, I framed every discussion as Florence evaluating which partnership would be most beneficial for our mutual goals. I would present each power with multiple options for cooperation, carefully structured so that all the options served Florence's core interests while giving our negotiating partners the satisfaction of believing they had won the better deal. For example, when negotiating with the French in 1504, I presented three possible arrangements. Florence could provide military support for French operations in Naples, offer financial assistance for their campaigns in the north, or serve as a neutral buffer zone while facilitating French diplomatic communications with other Italian states. Each option had different terms and conditions, but all three ensured that Florence would remain under French protection while avoiding the most dangerous military commitments. The French negotiators spent weeks debating which option best served their interests, never recognizing that I had designed all three to serve Florence's interests first. They felt clever and strategic for choosing what they believed was the optimal arrangement, when in fact they were choosing between different ways to give us what we needed. Their sense of agency made them more committed to honoring the agreement because they felt ownership of the decision. This technique works because humans have a deep psychological need to believe they are making free choices. When people feel they are being forced or manipulated, they instinctively resist even when compliance would serve their own interests. But when they believe they are evaluating options and selecting the best alternative, they become invested in making their choice work successfully. The foundation of creating effective choice illusions is understanding what outcomes you actually need versus what outcomes you merely prefer. Most people make the mistake of trying to get everything they want, which leaves no room for their targets to feel like they're getting a good deal. The key is identifying your non-negotiable requirements and then being flexible about everything else. In my diplomatic work, Florence's non-negotiable requirement was maintaining independence and avoiding destruction. Everything else, which foreign power we nominally supported, what tribute we paid, what ceremonial honors we offered, was negotiable. This gave me enormous flexibility in structuring agreements that felt generous to our partners while securing our central interests. The most sophisticated version of this technique involves presenting options that appear to offer different benefits but actually provide the same core advantages to you. I learned this from watching how the Medici Bank structured loans to European monarchs. They would offer kings various financing arrangements, different interest rates, repayment schedules, and collateral requirements that appeared to give the borrowers meaningful choices about their financial obligations. In reality, all the options were designed to make the monarchs dependent on continued Medici financing, while ensuring that the bank's political influence grew, regardless of which specific terms were selected. A king might choose lower interest rates in exchange for longer repayment periods, or higher rates for more flexible collateral arrangements. But every choice increased his reliance on Medici goodwill and expanded the bank's leverage over his decisions. The psychological sophistication of this approach lies in how it exploits the human tendency to focus on differences between options, rather than examining what all the options have in common. People become so absorbed in evaluating the relative merits of choice A versus choice B, that they never question whether both choices serve the interests of the person presenting the options. This principle applies perfectly to modern situations. In business negotiations, you can present different pricing structures, delivery schedules, or service packages that give clients the satisfaction of choosing the arrangement that best fits their needs, while ensuring that all the packages provide you with acceptable profit margins and contract terms. In management situations, you can offer employees different ways to achieve performance goals, various professional development paths, or multiple project assignments, while ensuring that all the options advance your department's objectives. The crucial element is making the choices feel meaningful and distinct, while keeping the underlying structure aligned with your goals. People must perceive real differences between their options, even if those differences don't affect the fundamental outcome you're seeking. This perception of choice creates psychological ownership and reduces resistance to implementation. Another powerful application involves controlling the information people use to make their choices. By determining what options they know about and how those options are framed, you can influence their decisions without restricting their freedom to choose. This is more subtle than limiting their choices directly and creates less psychological reactance. During the Pisan War, I used this technique when negotiating with potential allies who might support either Florence or Pisa. Rather than trying to prevent them from hearing Pisan arguments, I made sure they heard those arguments in contexts that made them seem less attractive. I would arrange for Pisan representatives to make their case immediately after they had received bad news about Pisan military defeats, or during social situations where the Pisan speakers appeared desperate or unreasonable. The same information presented in different contexts creates very different impressions. A proposal that sounds generous when you're feeling confident and secure can sound like a desperate plea when you're feeling uncertain and pressured. By controlling the timing and context of when people encounter their options, you can influence their evaluations without changing the substance of what they're choosing between. The most advanced practitioners of this technique also control the criteria people use to evaluate their choices. Instead of simply presenting options, you help people understand what factors should be most important in their decision-making process. If you can establish the evaluation framework, you can often predict and influence the outcome regardless of what specific options are available. For instance, when Florence was choosing between different mercenary companies for our military needs, I didn't just present information about their costs, experience, and availability. I spent considerable effort establishing that reliability and local knowledge should be the primary criteria for selection, rather than simply choosing the cheapest or most prestigious option. Once this evaluation framework was accepted, the choice naturally pointed toward the companies that best served our strategic interests. This approach works because most people don't have clear, predetermined criteria for making complex decisions. They develop their evaluation framework as they consider their options, which means the person who influences that framework development has enormous power over the final decision. By helping people understand what they should care about, you can guide them toward conclusions that serve your interests, while allowing them to feel rational and thoughtful about their choices. The final element of creating effective choice illusions is timing the revelation of options. People make different decisions when they evaluate all their choices simultaneously versus when they encounter options sequentially. They also respond differently when they feel time pressure versus when they feel they have unlimited time to decide. I learned to present initial options that were acceptable but not optimal, allowing people to feel they were making reasonable progress in negotiations. Then, at carefully calculated moments, I would introduce additional alternatives that appeared more attractive but actually served my interests even better. The contrast effect made these later options seem like significant improvements, even when they provided me with better terms than my original proposals. The key insight is that people don't evaluate choices in absolute terms. They evaluate them relative to other available options and their recent experiences. By controlling the sequence and timing of when options become available, you can influence how people perceive the value and attractiveness of each alternative. Remember that the goal isn't to trick people into making choices they'll later regret. Sustainable influence requires that people feel satisfied with their decisions over time. The most effective choice illusions provide real benefits to all parties, while ensuring that the distribution of those benefits favors your interests. When people get value from their choices, they remain willing to engage in future decision-making processes with you, which extends your influence over time. Information is the most valuable currency in any system of power, because it allows you to see around corners that blind your competitors. During my years as secretary, I built an intelligence network that reached from the courts of France to the counting houses of Venice. And it was this network, not military strength or wealth, that kept Florence alive when more powerful states wanted to devour us. The foundation of any effective intelligence operation is understanding that information flows along the same channels as human relationships: personal loyalty, financial obligation, shared secrets, and mutual dependency. People share sensitive information with those they trust, owe favors to, or need something from. Your job is to position yourself at the intersection of these relationships, so that valuable intelligence naturally flows through you. I began building my network by identifying people who were professionally required to know things, but were undervalued by their employers. Secretaries, clerks, translators, messengers, and minor officials often possessed detailed knowledge about important matters, but received little recognition or compensation for their discretion. These people became the foundation of my intelligence system because they had access to valuable information but compelling reasons to share it with someone who appreciated their worth. My most valuable source was a clerk in the Papal Chancery named Pietro Bembo, who handled correspondence between the Pope and various European courts. Pietro was brilliant, educated, and deeply frustrated by his low status, despite his critical role in papal diplomacy. I cultivated his friendship by treating him as an intellectual equal, seeking his opinions on matters of policy and literature. I arranged for him to receive small gifts and invitations to social gatherings where he could meet people who respected his expertise. In return, Pietro provided me with advanced knowledge of papal decisions, insights into the personal dynamics between church officials, and copies of diplomatic correspondence that revealed the true intentions of European powers. He never felt like he was betraying his employer because I never asked him for specific documents or explicit secrets. Instead, our conversations were simply intellectual discussions between friends who happened to share an interest in political affairs. This illustrates the first principle of intelligence gathering. Never make people feel like spies. Instead, make them feel like valued advisors whose insights are appreciated by someone who understands their worth. People will share remarkable amounts of sensitive information when they believe they're contributing to important work rather than committing betrayal. The second principle is creating webs of mutual obligation, where information flows naturally as part of ongoing relationships. I developed a practice of sharing non-sensitive, but useful, intelligence with potential sources before asking them for anything in return. This established me as a valuable contact who provided benefit to others, which made them more willing to reciprocate when I needed information from their spheres of knowledge. For example, I would share intelligence about French troop movements with Venetian contacts who needed that information for their own planning. In return, they would naturally share their insights about Venetian diplomatic initiatives that affected Florence's interests. Neither party felt they were being exploited, because both were receiving value from the exchange. The most sophisticated intelligence operations involve creating information that serves your purposes while appearing to come from independent sources. This requires understanding how rumors, gossip, and informal communication networks operate within the organizations and social groups you want to influence. I perfected this technique during the negotiations that ended the Pisan War. I needed the Pisan leadership to believe that their French allies were preparing to abandon them. But I couldn't simply assert this directly because they would dismiss it as Florentine propaganda. Instead, I arranged for this information to reach them through a chain of seemingly independent sources. I began by sharing fabricated intelligence about French financial difficulties with a Genoese merchant who traded with both French and Pisan contacts. The merchant naturally shared this concerning information with his Pisan clients as a warning about potential payment delays. Meanwhile, I arranged for a French deserter to be captured near Pisan territory with forged documents suggesting that French forces were being recalled to deal with problems in the north. Finally, I had one of my agents pose as a sympathetic intermediary who offered to negotiate secret communications between Pisa and France to clarify the situation. When the French failed to respond enthusiastically to these overtures, because I had arranged for the messages to be delayed and their responses to be intercepted, the Pisans concluded that their allies were indeed preparing to abandon them. The beauty of this operation was that each piece of information seemed to come from a different, independent source, creating a pattern that appeared to confirm French unreliability. The Pisans reached the conclusion I wanted them to reach, but they believed they had discovered this truth through their own investigation, rather than being manipulated by Florentine intelligence. This demonstrates the third principle of information warfare. Controlling the narrative is more powerful than controlling the facts. People make decisions based on the stories they tell themselves about what information means, not just on the raw data itself. By influencing how information is framed, timed, and contextualized, you can shape those narratives in ways that serve your interests. The fourth principle is that information must be actionable to be valuable. Raw intelligence is worthless unless it can be transformed into strategic advantage. This means developing the analytical capabilities to understand what information means and how it can be applied to influence outcomes. I spent countless hours studying the personality profiles, decision-making patterns, and psychological vulnerabilities of key political figures throughout Europe. This allowed me to predict how they would respond to different types of pressure, what arguments would persuade them, and what fears would motivate their behavior. When I received intelligence about their activities or intentions, I could immediately assess what it meant for Florence's interests and how we could respond most effectively. The most important insight about intelligence work is that your network must be sustainable over time. People will continue providing information only if they receive ongoing value from the relationship and feel secure about their involvement. This requires treating sources as long-term assets rather than short-term resources to be exploited and discarded. I maintained my intelligence network by ensuring that every source benefited from their association with me. Some received financial compensation, others gained access to social opportunities or career advancement, and many simply enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of discussing important affairs with someone who valued their insights. The key was matching the rewards to what each person actually wanted rather than assuming that money was the universal motivator. Modern applications of these principles are everywhere around us. In business, the most successful executives are those who maintain extensive networks of contacts, who keep them informed about industry developments, competitor activities, and market opportunities. In politics, effective leaders understand the informal communication channels that shape public opinion and policy decisions. In personal relationships, people who understand family dynamics, social hierarchies, and workplace politics consistently achieve better outcomes than those who focus only on official structures and formal rules. The technology has changed, but the fundamental principles remain constant. Information flows along relationship channels. People share secrets with those they trust or need something from, and strategic intelligence provides decisive advantages to those who know how to gather, analyze, and apply it effectively. The most crucial skill for maintaining long-term power is learning to appear virtuous while acting pragmatically. People need to believe that their leaders are moral, even when those leaders must make decisions that transcend conventional morality. This creates a fundamental tension that can only be resolved through the careful management of public perception and private action. I learned this lesson by watching Pope Alexander VI, one of history's most effective rulers and one of its most controversial figures. Alexander was simultaneously a devoted father, a shrewd politician, a patron of the arts, and a man who ordered assassinations with the same casual efficiency that other people ordered their meals. Yet he maintained his papal authority for over a decade because he understood the crucial distinction between being virtuous and appearing virtuous in public. Alexander was the picture of papal dignity. He celebrated masses with appropriate solemnity, spoke eloquently about Christian virtue, and patronized religious art and architecture that demonstrated his devotion to the Church's spiritual mission. But in private, he operated according to the brutal logic of Renaissance power politics, using bribery, intimidation, and violence to protect papal interests and advance his family's position. The key to his success was that these two personas never appeared to contradict each other. In public view, his political enemies knew perfectly well what he was doing behind the scenes, but they could never prove it in ways that would undermine his legitimate authority. Meanwhile, the broader public saw only the virtuous pope who spoke beautifully about moral principles and seemed to embody the dignity of his sacred office. This taught me that public virtue is a strategic necessity, not a moral luxury. People need to believe that power is exercised by individuals who share their values and moral commitments. If they lose faith in their leader's virtue, they lose faith in the legitimacy of the entire system. This makes everyone less secure and less prosperous, which serves no one's interests. But private pragmatism is equally necessary, because the world is not organized according to moral principles. Competitors will lie, cheat, and steal to gain advantages. Foreign enemies will exploit any weakness they can find. Economic forces will destroy the unprepared regardless of their moral worth. Leaders who refuse to acknowledge these realities and respond accordingly will be defeated by those who understand that survival requires more than good intentions. The solution is to maintain two different sets of standards, one for public consumption and one for private action. Your public persona must embody the virtues that people want to see in their leaders: honesty, fairness, compassion, integrity. Your private decision-making must be guided by effectiveness, strategic advantage, and long-term survival. The art lies in ensuring that these two sides of your character never visibly contradict each other. For example, the wool merchants wanted protection from foreign competition, while the silk traders wanted free access to international markets. Rather than choosing one policy that would unite both groups in opposition, I advocated for complex, trade regulations that protected wool while opening silk markets, giving each group what they wanted, while making them natural opponents on broader trade policy. Similarly, different noble families wanted prestigious government appointments for their members, but these appointments were limited. I ensured that the distribution of positions created a pattern where no single family felt completely excluded, but every family had reasons to resent the advantages given to their rivals. This kept them focused on competing with each other rather than organizing against the system that created their competition. The key to implementing divide and conquer strategies is understanding the natural fault lines within any group of potential opponents. People are rarely united by pure opposition to your authority. They're usually motivated by specific interests, grievances, or ambitions that may conflict with each other as much as they conflict with your position. Your job is to identify these internal contradictions and then structure situations so that addressing one group's concerns necessarily frustrates another group's goals. This doesn't require creating artificial conflicts, simply means recognizing existing tensions and ensuring that your policies and decisions amplify rather than resolve them. The most sophisticated version of this technique involves giving different groups partial victories that make them reluctant to risk their gains by joining broader opposition movements. When people have something to lose, they become more conservative about supporting risky challenges to the existing order, even when they might benefit from successful changes. I used this approach when dealing with the various mercenary companies that served Florence during different conflicts. These companies were natural rivals for contracts, territory, and prestige, but they could potentially unite against Florence if they concluded that we were exploiting them unfairly. My solution was to structure our contracts and payments in ways that made each company slightly better off than its competitors, but never so much better that the others felt completely excluded. Each mercenary captain believed he was getting favorable treatment from Florence, which made him reluctant to support any alliance that might jeopardize his advantageous position. Meanwhile, the other captains were motivated to maintain their relationships with Florence in hopes of eventually receiving similar preferences. This kept them competing for our favor, rather than collaborating against our interests. The foundation of this strategy is the recognition that most people care more about their relative position than their absolute position. Being slightly ahead of your peers is more satisfying than being significantly better off in isolation. This means you can often control behavior by managing comparative advantage rather than absolute benefit. In modern applications, this principle works just as effectively. In business organizations, you can manage team dynamics by ensuring that different departments or individuals have slightly different incentives that prevent them from organizing against management decisions. Give the sales team commission structures that reward individual performance, while giving the marketing team bonuses based on collaborative metrics. Neither group will want to sacrifice their specific advantages to support the other's priorities. In social situations, you can manage group dynamics by ensuring that different people receive different types of recognition or benefit from their association with you. Some people value public acknowledgement, others prefer private access, and still others want material benefits. By providing each person with the type of reward they value most, you create situations where they're reluctant to jeopardize their unique advantages by supporting others who want different things. However, divide and conquer strategies require careful maintenance because the divisions you create can become counterproductive if they grow too extreme. The goal is to prevent coordinated opposition, not to create chaos that undermines your own authority. People must remain functional and productive even while they're prevented from organizing against you. This means periodically adjusting the balance of advantages to ensure that no group becomes so frustrated that they abandon hope of improvement and decide they have nothing left to lose. Similarly, you must prevent any group from becoming so dominant that they no longer need your arbitration to maintain their position. The most sustainable approach is to rotate advantages over time so that different groups experience periods of relative success and relative frustration. This keeps everyone invested in the system because they know their situation can improve, while preventing anyone from becoming permanently entrenched in either dominance or opposition. The ultimate goal is to become indispensable as the mediator of conflicts that you've helped to perpetuate. When different groups depend on your judgment to resolve their disputes and your favor to advance their interests, they become stakeholders in maintaining your authority rather than threats to your position. Their energy gets channeled into competition for your approval rather than collaboration against your influence. Remember that this strategy works best when people don't realize they're being deliberately divided. If your manipulation becomes obvious, it can backfire by giving potential opponents a shared grievance against your tactics. The divisions must feel natural and the competitions must seem organic, even when they're carefully orchestrated to serve your strategic goals. Most people lose power because they cannot resist the temptation of immediate gratification. They take short-term gains that create long-term vulnerabilities, or they respond to temporary setbacks with desperate actions that compound their problems. True mastery of influence requires the discipline to think in decades rather than months, and to sacrifice immediate satisfaction for eventual dominance. I learned this lesson by studying the rise of the Medici family across 4 generations. Cosimo, the elder, understood that lasting power couldn't be built through dramatic gestures or forceful seizures of authority. Instead, he spent 30 years quietly making himself indispensable to Florence's economic and political life, building relationships and obligations that would serve his family long after his death. Cosimo never held official political office, but he controlled Florence more effectively than any official ruler, because he had invested decades in creating a network of dependencies that made opposition to Medici interests practically impossible. He loaned money to promising young politicians, funded public works that employed the common people, and patronized artists and scholars who enhanced Florence's cultural prestige. Each action seemed modest in isolation, but collectively they created a foundation of influence that lasted for generations. When I began my own career, I was impatient for recognition and advancement. I wanted immediate results from my diplomatic missions and visible success that would demonstrate my competence to my superiors. This urgency made me less effective because I focused on achieving quick wins rather than building the relationships and reputation that would serve me throughout my career. The turning point came during my negotiations with the court of Louis XII. I had been sent to secure French support for Florence's war against Pisa, and I was frustrated by the slow pace of French decision-making. My instinct was to pressure the French for immediate commitments, but I realized that this approach would mark me as just another desperate Italian supplicant seeking temporary assistance. Instead, I decided to invest my time in understanding French strategic priorities and positioning Florence as a long-term asset rather than a short-term burden. I spent months studying French policy toward Italy, identifying the key advisors who influenced royal decisions, and demonstrating that Florence's interests aligned with France's broader goals in the region. This patient approach required accepting frustration and apparent inaction in the short term, but it paid enormous dividends. Over time, the French began to see me as a valuable source of Italian intelligence and strategic insight rather than just another petitioner. When they eventually provided the support Florence needed, it came with better terms and greater reliability than I could have achieved through urgent pressure. The psychological foundation of long-term thinking is understanding that most significant achievements require sustained effort over extended periods. People who focus on immediate results consistently underestimate the time required to build lasting influence and overestimate their ability to achieve permanent gains through dramatic actions. This impatience creates opportunities for those who are willing to work on longer timescales, while your competitors are chasing immediate victories and responding to temporary setbacks. You can be building the infrastructure of influence that will give you overwhelming advantages when the right opportunities emerge. The key to implementing long-term strategies is identifying the fundamental forces and trends that will shape your environment over time, then positioning yourself to benefit from those changes, regardless of short-term fluctuations. This requires distinguishing between temporary circumstances and permanent structural shifts. For example, I recognized early in my career that the balance of power in Italy was fundamentally unstable because the peninsula was divided into small states that were individually vulnerable to larger European powers. This meant that survival would ultimately depend on either unification under a strong Italian leader or accommodation with foreign dominance. Since unification seemed impossible, given Italian political culture, accommodation was the only viable long-term strategy. This insight guided my diplomatic efforts for decades. While other Italian leaders focused on immediate military victories or temporary alliances, I worked to position Florence as the most reliable and valuable Italian partner for whichever foreign power eventually achieved dominance in the region. This required swallowing considerable pride and accepting subordinate status, but it ensured Florence's survival when more successful. Italian states were eventually destroyed or absorbed. The most advanced application of long-term thinking involves planting seeds that will grow into advantages years or decades later. This might mean cultivating relationships with people who are currently unimportant, but who have potential for future advancement, or investing in capabilities that aren't immediately useful, but will become essential as circumstances change. I practiced this by maintaining correspondence with minor officials and younger family members throughout Europe, even when they had no current influence over matters that affected Florence. Many of these relationships seemed worthless at the time, but some of these individuals eventually achieved positions where their goodwill toward me became strategically valuable. Similarly, I studied subjects like military engineering and commercial law that weren't directly relevant to my diplomatic responsibilities, but which gave me expertise that became crucial when Florence's needs evolved. The knowledge I gained about fortification design proved essential when we had to defend against siege warfare, and my understanding of international commercial practices became valuable when trade disputes affected our diplomatic relationships. Long-term thinking also requires accepting that some battles aren't worth winning if victory creates worse problems later. This means developing the discipline to lose strategically when losing serves your long-term interests better than winning would. During the negotiations that ended the Pisan War, I could have pressed for terms that would have humiliated Pisa and demonstrated Florence's complete victory, but I recognized that Pisa would eventually become our neighbor again, and that creating permanent resentment would make future cooperation impossible. Instead, I negotiated terms that allowed Pisan leaders to preserve their dignity while accepting Florentine authority, creating the foundation for stable, long-term relations. The emotional challenge of long-term strategy is dealing with the frustration of delayed gratification and the uncertainty of eventual success. Most people abandon patient approaches because they become anxious about whether their investments will pay off, or because they see others achieving immediate gains through more aggressive tactics. The solution is developing confidence in your analysis and commitment to your timeline. If you understand the fundamental forces that will drive future developments, you can remain patient during periods when your approach seems to be failing. The key is distinguishing between strategic patience and passive waiting. You must continue taking active steps toward your long-term goals even when immediate results aren't visible. I would present him with complex political problems and genuinely seek his analysis, then respond to his ideas with enthusiasm and detailed engagement that made him feel intellectually validated. Over time, Francesco began to associate his sense of intellectual confidence with our conversations, which made him more eager to maintain our friendship and more receptive to my influence on matters where our interests might diverge. This wasn't exploitation because Francesco genuinely benefited from our relationship. He did produce better thinking through our collaboration, and his confidence was justified by his actual capabilities. But I had structured the relationship so that his intellectual satisfaction depended on my continued engagement and approval, which gave me significant influence over his decisions and loyalties. The most advanced form of emotional manipulation involves helping people become better versions of themselves in ways that also serve your interests. When you genuinely contribute to someone's personal growth, happiness, or success, they develop a deep gratitude and loyalty that transcends simple reciprocity. They begin to see you as essential to their well-being because you actually have become essential to their well-being. This approach requires real investment in understanding and supporting what people need to flourish, but it creates the strongest possible emotional bonds because it's based on genuine mutual benefit rather than just psychological exploitation. The person feels better about themselves when they're with you because they actually are better when they're with you, and you benefit because their improvement serves your interests. However, emotional manipulation carries unique risks that other forms of influence don't. When you become essential to someone's emotional life, you also become responsible for their psychological well-being in ways that can become burdensome or dangerous. People who are emotionally dependent can become possessive, demanding, or unstable if they perceive threats to the relationship. Moreover, emotional manipulation requires maintaining performance standards that can be exhausting over time. If someone's happiness depends on your continued attention and approval, you must consistently provide that attention even when you're dealing with your own problems or priorities. The relationship becomes a responsibility that can limit your freedom and flexibility. The key to managing these risks is ensuring that emotional dependencies remain mutually beneficial and that you maintain some psychological distance even while providing emotional satisfaction. You must care enough to be genuinely supportive, but not so much that you lose your ability to make objective decisions about the relationship when necessary. Remember that emotional manipulation, more than any other form of influence, requires absolute authenticity in your execution. People have highly sensitive intuitive abilities when it comes to detecting false emotion or insincere care. If your emotional responses don't feel genuine, the manipulation will not only fail, but will create lasting damage to your credibility and relationships. The goal is not to fake emotions, but to cultivate genuine emotional responses that serve your strategic interests, while also providing real value to others. When you can honestly care about people in ways that also advance your goals, you achieve the most sustainable and powerful form of influence possible. The hardest lesson in the exercise of power is learning when to abandon relationships that have outlived their usefulness. Loyalty is a virtue, but blind loyalty is a weakness that others will exploit. The most successful leaders understand that every alliance, friendship, and partnership exists to serve mutual interests. And when those interests no longer align, maintaining the relationship becomes a liability that threatens your ability to serve your other obligations. I learned this brutal truth by watching Caesar Borgia's treatment of his former allies at These men, Vitellozzo Vitelli, Paolo Orsini, and Francesco Orsini, had been Borgia's partners in conquering the Romagna. They had risked their armies, their fortunes, and their lives to help him build his kingdom, but they had also grown powerful enough to threaten that kingdom's stability. and they had begun making demands that would have undermined Borgia's authority. Borgia faced a choice that every successful leader eventually confronts: preserve relationships that had become dangerous, or eliminate threats that had once been assets. He chose survival over sentiment, and in a single night, he destroyed men who had considered themselves his trusted partners. It was ruthless, but it was also necessary for the preservation of everything they had built together. The psychological difficulty of strategic betrayal is that it requires acting against people who trust you, and who may have legitimate reasons for that trust. This creates emotional conflict that can paralyze decision-making or lead to half measures that satisfy neither loyalty nor strategy. The key is understanding that betrayal in the service of larger responsibilities isn't a moral failure, it's a recognition that competing loyalties sometimes make choices inevitable. During my own career, I faced this dilemma when I had to choose between my personal friendship with Pier Soderini, Florence's gonfalonier, and my assessment of what Florence needed to survive the return of the Medici. Soderini had been my patron and supporter for over a decade. He had given me opportunities, defended my policies, and trusted my judgment even when others questioned my competence. But by 1512, it had become clear that Soderini's rigid republicanism and refusal to compromise with changing political realities were endangering Florence's survival. The Medici had Spanish military support, papal backing, and the momentum of inevitable victory. Soderini's determination to resist their return would only ensure that Florence was destroyed in the process of their restoration. Kay began quietly preparing for a transition that Soderini refused to acknowledge was necessary. I maintained contacts with potential Medici representatives, preserved important documents that would be needed for administrative continuity, and positioned myself as someone who could help facilitate a peaceful transfer of power. When the crisis finally arrived, I was ready to serve Florence's interests, even though doing so meant abandoning the man who had made my career possible. This reframing was crucial because it preserved Florence's reputation and morale during a period when military defeat could have led to psychological collapse. Our citizens could accept temporary subordination as a strategic choice rather than humiliating failure, which maintained their willingness to support future diplomatic initiatives when circumstances improved. The most powerful narratives are those that make people feel better about themselves while accepting the outcomes you need them to accept. This requires understanding what psychological needs drive your audience's self-perception, then crafting explanations that satisfy those needs while supporting your strategic goals. People need to believe that their choices are rational, that their values are vindicated by events, and that their future prospects remain positive. If you can provide interpretations that satisfy these psychological requirements while directing behavior toward your preferred outcomes, you can influence decision-making without appearing to manipulate anyone. The key technique is selective emphasis rather than outright fabrication. Every complex situation contains multiple elements that can be highlighted or minimized depending on what story you want to tell. Your job is to identify the aspects of reality that support your preferred interpretation and ensure that those aspects receive the most attention in public discussion. I perfected this technique during the aftermath of Florence's victory over Pisa. The military campaign had been long, expensive, and largely unsuccessful until French intervention finally forced Pisan surrender. These facts could have been interpreted as evidence of Florentine military incompetence and dangerous dependence on foreign support. Instead, I emphasized different aspects of the same events: our strategic patience in waiting for optimal conditions, our diplomatic skill in securing French assistance, and our ultimate success in achieving our territorial goals. The length of the campaign became evidence of our persistence rather than our weakness. The French intervention became proof of our alliance management rather than our military inadequacy. This narrative served multiple purposes simultaneously. It preserved military morale by allowing soldiers to feel proud of their eventual success. It maintained public support by emphasizing positive outcomes rather than disappointing processes. Most importantly, it positioned Florence as a competent ally, worthy of continued French partnership, rather than a burden that had required costly assistance. The most sophisticated narrative control involves making your interpretation seem inevitable and objective, rather than partisan and self-serving. This requires acknowledging negative aspects of your position, while embedding them in contexts that minimize their significance and emphasize compensating advantages. When I had to explain Florence's failures during various military campaigns, I didn't deny those failures or attempt to shift blame to others. Instead, I contextualized them within larger patterns that made them seem like temporary setbacks in ultimately successful strategies. A defeat became a learning experience that prepared us for future victory. A strategic withdrawal became evidence of our wisdom in avoiding unnecessary losses. This approach is more credible than simple propaganda because it acknowledges reality while shaping interpretation. People can verify the basic facts you're presenting, which makes them more likely to accept your analysis of what those facts mean. They feel like they're reaching their own conclusions rather than accepting your spin, even when their conclusions have been carefully guided by your presentation. Modern applications of narrative control are everywhere in successful leadership. Business executives shape how company performance is interpreted by emphasizing metrics that support their strategic vision while downplaying indicators that suggest problems. Political leaders frame policy outcomes in terms of the values and priorities that their constituents care about most. Even in personal relationships, people influence how their behavior is understood by controlling the context in which their actions are discussed. The digital age has made narrative control both more important and more challenging. Information spreads faster and reaches larger audiences, but it also faces more competition from alternative interpretations. The key is establishing your narrative quickly and reinforcing it through multiple channels before opposing views can gain momentum. Remember that sustainable narrative control must have some foundation in reality. Pure fiction is eventually exposed, and when people discover they've been deceived, they become permanently skeptical of your future communications. The most effective approach is to tell truthful stories that emphasize the aspects of truth that serve your interests while minimizing aspects that don't. The ultimate goal is to become the primary source that people turn to for understanding complex events. When your interpretation becomes the default framework that others use to make sense of new information, you've achieved a form of influence that transcends any specific decision or outcome. You've become essential to how people think, which is the deepest possible form of control. The people closest to you will determine the quality of your information, the soundness of your decisions, and ultimately the success or failure of your ambitions. Choosing your inner circle is perhaps the most critical decision any leader makes, because these individuals will have access to your thoughts, influence over your choices, and the power to either strengthen or sabotage your position from within. I learned this lesson by studying the contrasting approaches of Pope Julius II and his predecessor, Alexander VI. Alexander surrounded himself with family members and longtime personal allies, who were absolutely loyal but often incompetent. Julius selected advisors based primarily on their capabilities, accepting higher risks of disloyalty in exchange for superior counsel and execution. The difference in their effectiveness was striking. Alexander's inner circle protected him from external threats, but often protected him too well from uncomfortable truths. His advisors told him what they thought he wanted to hear, rather than what he needed to know. They competed for his favor rather than focusing on solving problems. The Venetians, for example, continued to rely on their traditional policy of playing different powers against each other. Even after France and Spain had become too powerful to be meaningfully manipulated by any Italian state, their failure to adapt to the new reality eventually led to devastating defeats that could have been avoided if they had recognized earlier that their circumstances had changed. This historical analysis helped me understand that adaptation isn't just about responding to current problems, it's about positioning yourself for future challenges that may not yet be visible. The leaders who survive major transitions are those who begin preparing for change before that change becomes obvious to everyone else. Modern successful adaptation requires developing multiple capabilities that can be deployed in different circumstances. Instead of becoming expert in one approach, you need to become competent in several approaches so you can shift between them as situations require. During my diplomatic career, I deliberately cultivated relationships with different types of people and expertise in different types of negotiations. I could work with military commanders, financial administrators, legal scholars, and court nobles because I had taken the time to understand their different languages and priorities. When circumstances changed, I had multiple avenues for remaining relevant and useful. The psychological foundation of successful adaptation is maintaining confidence in your ability to learn and grow, while accepting that your current knowledge and skills may become obsolete. This requires a particular kind of intellectual humility, confidence in your capacity to master new challenges, combined with recognition that mastery in one area doesn't guarantee success in another. I practiced this by regularly seeking out people who knew things I didn't know and asking them to explain concepts that were outside my expertise. I read extensively in fields that weren't directly related to my work, but that might become relevant if circumstances changed. I treated every conversation as an opportunity to learn something that might prove useful in unpredictable future situations. The timing of adaptation is crucial because moving too early can be as dangerous as moving too late. If you abandon successful strategies before change is actually necessary, you may sacrifice effective approaches for uncertain alternatives. But if you wait until change is forced upon you, you may lack the time and resources necessary for smooth transition. The key is developing sensitivity to leading indicators that suggest when change may be approaching. These might include shifts in the balance of power among key players, changes in the resources available for different types of activities, or modifications in the criteria that people use to evaluate success and failure. In my case, the growing Spanish influence in Italian affairs was a clear signal that the political dynamics I had mastered were becoming obsolete. Spanish intervention methods were different from French approaches. Spanish strategic priorities didn't align with traditional Italian interests, and Spanish resources dwarfed anything that Italian states could mobilize independently. Have begun adapting to this new reality years before the crisis that ended my career, but I was too invested in the methods that had brought me success to recognize how fundamentally the environment was changing. This taught me that successful adaptation requires the courage to abandon comfort zones before circumstances force that abandonment. Remember that adaptation doesn't mean abandoning your fundamental character or values. The goal is to find new ways of expressing your core strengths rather than becoming a completely different person. The most sustainable adaptations build on existing capabilities whilst extending them into new areas of application. Your fundamental understanding of human nature, your analytical capabilities, your relationship building skills, these core competencies remain valuable even when the specific contexts where you apply them change dramatically. The challenge is learning to deploy these strengths in new environments while developing additional capabilities that complement your existing ones. 500 years have passed since I wrote The Prince, and yet the fundamental dynamics of power remain unchanged. Technology has evolved, political systems have been transformed, and social structures have been revolutionized. But human nature continues to operate according to the same principles that governed Renaissance Italy. The ambitious still seek advancement, the fearful still seek security, and the powerful still seek to maintain their advantages. The modern world offers unprecedented opportunities for applying the principles I discovered. Because information travels faster, relationships can be maintained across greater distances, and influence can be exercised through channels that didn't exist in my time. But these same technologies also create new vulnerabilities and require more sophisticated approaches to the timeless art of control. In today's corporate environment, the principle of creating dependency has become more refined, but no less powerful. Modern executives don't control armies or territories, but they control access to resources, information, and opportunities that others need for their success. The most influential corporate leaders are those who make themselves indispensable by becoming the gateway to critical capabilities or relationships. Consider how successful technology executives build their power within organizations. They don't just manage systems, they become the exclusive source of understanding about how those systems work and how they can be leveraged for strategic advantage. They cultivate relationships with external vendors, develop expertise in emerging technologies, and position themselves as essential translators between technical possibilities and business objectives. This creates the same dynamic I observed in Renaissance diplomacy. People throughout the organization become dependent on their expertise and connections, making them more powerful than their formal authority would suggest. Their influence grows because others need what they provide, not because they have been granted official power over those others. The modern application of fear as a tool of influence has become more psychological and less physical, but no less effective. In professional environments, social fear, the fear of exclusion, humiliation, or loss of status motivates behavior, just as powerfully as physical threats motivated behavior in my time. The most skilled modern manipulators understand how to create uncertainty about consequences while maintaining clear expectations about behavior. They establish reputations for remembering both loyalty and disloyalty, for rewarding those who support their initiatives and excluding those who oppose them from future opportunities. They don't need to threaten anyone directly. Their track record creates an atmosphere where people understand the potential costs of resistance. This is particularly evident in how successful leaders manage their professional networks. They become known as people who remember favors and who have long memories for slights. They create situations where cooperating with them opens doors while opposing them closes off opportunities. The fear isn't of immediate punishment, but of long-term career consequences that accumulate over time. The principle of controlling choices has become even more sophisticated in an era of information abundance. Modern influence often involves curating the options that people consider rather than limiting their freedom to choose. Digital platforms demonstrate this principle constantly. They don't prevent users from accessing information, but they shape what information users encounter and how that information is presented. In business negotiations, skilled practitioners present multiple options that appear to offer meaningful choices while ensuring that all the options serve their fundamental interests. They might offer different pricing structures, various service levels, or alternative contract terms that give clients the satisfaction of choosing the arrangement that best fits their needs, while ensuring that every choice provides acceptable margins and strategic advantages. The creation of emotional dependency has been revolutionized by modern communication technologies. Today's most influential leaders build psychological connections across vast networks of relationships that would have been impossible to maintain in my era. They use social media, email, and other digital tools to provide personalized attention and validation to hundreds or thousands of people simultaneously. But the underlying psychology remains identical to what I observed in Renaissance courts. People become emotionally dependent on those who make them feel important, understood, and valued. The medium has changed, but the message and its effect on human behavior remains constant. The most sophisticated modern practitioners understand how to use digital tools to create the illusion of personal connection at scale. They develop systems for remembering personal details about their contacts, for celebrating others' achievements, and for providing support during difficult times. They become associated with positive emotions and personal validation in ways that create lasting loyalty and influence. The challenge of maintaining virtue while exercising pragmatic power has become more complex in an era of constant media scrutiny and social media amplification. Modern leaders must be even more careful about managing the gap between their public image and their private methods, because any contradiction can be exposed and disseminated instantly. Yet the fundamental principle remains unchanged. People need to believe that their leaders share their values, even when those leaders must sometimes act in ways that transcend conventional morality. The solution is still to genuinely embody the virtues that people want to see, while privately acknowledging that virtue alone is insufficient for achieving important goals. Modern technology has also amplified the importance of controlling narratives and managing information flow. In my time, controlling information meant intercepting letters and managing rumors spread through personal conversations. Today, it involves understanding how information spreads through digital networks and how algorithms determine what content people encounter. The principles of narrative control that I developed remain applicable, but they must be adapted to environments where information moves faster and reaches larger audiences. The key is still establishing your interpretation of events before alternative explanations can gain momentum. But this now requires understanding how digital platforms amplify certain types of content while suppressing others. Perhaps most importantly, the pace of change in modern environments has made adaptability more critical than ever. The half-life of successful strategies has shortened dramatically, which means that leaders must be constantly evolving their approaches while maintaining their fundamental objectives. This requires developing the same psychological flexibility I learned during my exile, the ability to abandon successful methods when circumstances change, while preserving the underlying insights that made those methods effective. In rapidly changing environments, clinging to specific tactics is a recipe for obsolescence, but abandoning core principles is a recipe for confusion. The most successful modern leaders are those who understand that my principles are frameworks for thinking about power rather than rigid formulas for achieving it. They adapt these concepts to their specific circumstances while maintaining focus on the fundamental dynamics that drive human behavior in any era. The ultimate insight is that power remains a human phenomenon regardless of technological advancement. While the tools and contexts evolve, the basic motivations that drive people to seek influence and the psychological mechanisms that make influence effective remain constant. Understanding these timeless dynamics provides a foundation for adapting to any future changes that technology and society may bring. Whether you're managing a corporate team, building a political movement, or simply trying to advance your personal goals, the principles I discovered in Renaissance Italy can guide your efforts if you understand how to apply them thoughtfully to your modern circumstances. Human nature hasn't changed. Only the stage on which it performs has become larger and more complex. As I near the end of my teachings, I must tell you the truth that most who seek power refuse to acknowledge. Every technique I have shared with you comes with a price that extends far beyond what you might expect to pay. The pursuit of control over others inevitably changes who you are. and not all of those changes are beneficial to your soul or your happiness. I learned this lesson not through study or observation, but through the gradual transformation of my own character during my years of wielding influence. When I began my career, I was motivated by genuine patriotism and a sincere desire to serve Florence's interests. I believed that understanding power was simply a practical necessity for protecting what I loved. I never intended to become the calculating manipulator that effectiveness required me to become. But influence is a skill that changes you through its practice. Each time you choose strategic advantage over emotional honesty, each time you sacrifice a relationship for a larger goal, each time you present a mask instead of your authentic self, you become slightly more distant from the person you originally were. These changes accumulate so gradually that you often don't notice them until the transformation is complete. The most insidious aspect of this evolution is that it's often accompanied by genuine success. As you become more skilled at reading people's motivations, manipulating their choices, and controlling their behavior, you also become more effective at achieving your goals. This success validates your methods and makes it easier to justify the continued use of techniques that might have troubled you initially. I remember the first time I deliberately deceived someone who trusted me in order to serve what I believed was a greater good. The guilt was significant, and I told myself it would be the last time I would compromise my integrity for strategic advantage. But circumstances continued to present situations where honesty would have led to worse outcomes for everyone involved. And gradually, strategic deception became a natural part of my toolkit. The danger isn't that you become evil. Most people who master these techniques retain their fundamental moral commitments and continue trying to serve worthy goals. The danger is that you become isolated, because genuine relationships become impossible when you're constantly analyzing, manipulating, and controlling the people around you. When you truly understand how people's minds work, when you can predict their behavior and influence their choices, spontaneous friendship becomes nearly impossible. Every conversation becomes a chess game. Every relationship becomes a strategic asset. And every interaction becomes an opportunity to gather information or exercise influence. You may still care about people, but you can never again relate to them with complete authenticity. This isolation is compounded by the fact that you cannot share your knowledge with others without destroying its effectiveness. The techniques I have taught you work precisely because they operate below the level of conscious awareness. If people understand how they're being influenced, they will resist that influence and likely resent you for attempting it. This means that your deepest professional insights cannot be discussed with colleagues. Your most effective strategies cannot be shared with friends, and your understanding of human nature must remain largely secret even from those closest to you. You become like a magician who can never reveal how the tricks are performed, not because of professional pride, but because the revelation would destroy the magic itself. The psychological burden of maintaining this secrecy while continuing to use these techniques can be overwhelming. You begin to question whether your relationships are genuine or simply the result of your skillful manipulation. You wonder whether people would still like you if they knew how you really think about human nature and social interaction. You start to doubt your own motivations and wonder whether you're serving noble goals or simply feeding your ego through the exercise of power. I experienced this crisis most acutely during my exile, when I was stripped of position and influence, but retained all the knowledge and instincts I had developed during my career. Suddenly, I had to relate to people as equals rather than as subjects for manipulation. But I had forgotten how to do so authentically. My insights into human psychology had become so automatic that I couldn't turn them off. Even when I wanted simple, honest relationships, the friends who remained loyal during my exile often commented that I seemed different, more guarded, more calculating, less spontaneous than I had been in my youth. They were right, though they couldn't have understood why. The skills that had made me effective as a diplomat had made me less capable of being fully present as a friend. But perhaps the greatest cost of mastering these techniques is the way they change your fundamental relationship with truth. When you become expert at shaping narratives and controlling information flow, when you learn to present selective facts in ways that support your objectives, the distinction between truth and manipulation becomes blurred. You begin to tell yourself stories about your own motivations and actions, crafting narratives that make your behavior seem more noble or necessary than it actually is. You become skilled at self-justification, at finding moral frameworks that legitimize whatever strategic choices you need to make. Eventually, you may lose the ability to see yourself clearly because you've become too skilled at managing your own psychological narrative. This doesn't mean that studying power is inherently corrupting, or that influence is always destructive. Some of history's greatest leaders have used these techniques in service of genuinely worthy goals, and some of the most beneficial social changes have been achieved by people who understood how to manipulate others toward better outcomes. But you must enter this path with full awareness of what you're risking. If you choose to develop these capabilities, you must also develop the wisdom to know when not to use them, the strength to maintain authentic relationships despite your knowledge of how to control people, and the integrity to serve goals worthy of the personal costs that mastery will demand. Most people who seek power do so because they believe it will give them greater freedom and happiness. In reality, true mastery of influence often leads to a kind of golden cage where you are effective, but isolated, successful but not necessarily fulfilled. You gain the ability to control others, but may lose the ability to be completely honest with yourself. My final advice is this: use these techniques sparingly and only in service of goals that justify their personal cost. Develop your understanding of power as insurance against those who would manipulate you, but don't allow that understanding to become your primary mode of relating to the world. Maintain relationships and activities where you can be authentic, where effectiveness matters less than honesty, where you can remember who you were before you understood how to control others. The ultimate irony of power is that those who master it completely often discover that what they really wanted was never control over others, but the security, recognition, or meaning that they thought power would provide. These deeper needs can often be satisfied through means that don't require the sacrifice of your authentic self. Consider carefully whether the influence you seek is truly necessary for the life you want to live. If you decide to proceed down this path, remember that I have given you tools, not commandments. Your wisdom must guide when and how to use them. Your conscience must determine what goals justify their employment, and your humanity must survive their practice, or your success will be meaningless, regardless of how much control you achieve. The choice, as always, is yours. But now, at least, it is an informed choice.